The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 23, When the Past Knocks, Old Patterns at the Door. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we slow down, strip back the noise, and look at the truths we often try to dodge. In our last two arcs, Shadow Emotions, episodes 1 to 10, and Integration and Alchemy, episodes 11 to 20, we explored the hidden parts of ourselves and the work it takes to weave them into something whole. Now, in this new series, Ashes to Architecture: The Rebuild, we're looking at what comes after the dust settles, the choices, challenges, and quiet victories of creating a life that's not just repaired, but rebuilt. Today, we're talking about a moment that can catch anyone off guard when something from the past shows up at the door of your new life. It might arrive as a message, a familiar tone in someone's voice, or a temptation to repeat a pattern you thought you'd outgrown. This episode is about recognizing that knock, understanding why it's so hard to ignore, and learning how to keep your foundation intact without letting old patterns dictate the shape of your future. So let's begin. Recognizing the knock old patterns don't usually arrive announced. They don't knock politely and say, "Hello, I'm here to undo your progress." They tend to slip in quietly, wearing familiar faces, feelings, or circumstances, until one day you notice you're behaving in ways you thought you'd long left behind. The return of the familiar, sometimes the past, doesn't come back as a person. It comes back as a pattern, a tone in someone's voice, a shift in the air between you. An old set of reactions that you haven't felt in years suddenly rises, and it's as if a part of you that was once asleep has been shaken awake. At first, it can feel almost nostalgic. You think, "I've been here before." But if you've done the work to grow past those patterns, that familiarity carries a warning. This road leads somewhere you no longer want to go. The challenge is recognizing the moment it begins, not halfway down the road when the damage has already been done. It means noticing the subtle changes, the tightening in your chest, the way your thoughts speed up, or how you feel the need to explain yourself more than usual. These signals are the knock at the door. Personal reflection: I've had moments where the knock came quietly, but my reaction was loud. Recently, I made a connection that began well, with clear communication, good rapport, and mutual respect. But before long, something shifted. Their messages became infrequent, the tone more distant. That old fear rose, the worry that someone's intentions weren't what I thought. Out of self-protection, I pushed them away, convinced they were playing with my trust. Later, I reached out to take responsibility for my reaction, explaining I was trying not to repeat old cycles. They apologized, admitting they had ignored me on purpose, and for a moment I thought we had both owned our part and moved forward. But the communication stayed sporadic. I caught myself rushing to repair the connection, explaining, clarifying, almost bargaining to re-establish what we had at the start. That urgency was the pattern, and I recognized it too late. Days passed, my message went unread, and I removed it. Then came the final sign, a comment aimed at my work, turning what I thought was a truce into another round of tension. I stepped back. I didn't want to get pulled deeper into tit-for-tat interactions. Instead, I chose to see the whole exchange as a mirror, reflecting areas where I still react quickly, try to fix too soon, and assume that mutual accountability will always lead to resolution. That experience reminded me to slow down, be more decisive, and not explain myself into exhaustion when the truth of my intentions is already clear. Psychological insight. What happened here ties closely to relational schemas, the mental templates we carry from past relationships. Baldwin, 1992. When an interaction resembles something from our history, our brain often reacts as if it is the same situation, even if the person in front of us is different. This can activate schema-driven behavior, patterns of action and emotion we learned to protect ourselves in the past. Another key element is emotional flooding, Gottman, 1994, where strong feelings override rational thought, making us act from reflex rather than reflection. When communication changes unexpectedly, especially if we've been hurt before, the brain can shift into threat mode, triggering protective behaviors like withdrawal, defensiveness, or urgent repair attempts. Slowing down creates space for metacognition, thinking about our thinking, which allows us to step out of the pattern midstream. In my case, pausing to reflect helped me choose not to keep engaging when it became clear the interaction was cycling back into the very dynamic I wanted to avoid. Insight prompts. What are your personal warning signs that an old pattern might be reappearing? How do you usually respond to that knock, and what could you do differently? Theory in action. The next time you notice an emotional shift in a relationship, write down exactly what you're feeling and why you think it's happening before you act. Review your notes 24 hours later and see if your perspective has changed. This pause can reveal whether you're reacting to the current reality or a pattern from the past. The subtle invitations backwards old patterns rarely shout. They whisper. They don't drag you back in one dramatic leap. They invite you in small, almost imperceptible steps. It's those subtle invitations that are the most dangerous because they feel harmless in the moment. The familiar chair, imagine walking into a room you haven't visited in years and seeing your favorite old chair. The fabric is worn, the cushion slightly sagged, but it's the chair you once curled up in during long nights. You tell yourself, just for a moment, and sink in. At first, it feels comfortable, familiar in an almost soothing way. But after a while, you remember why you stopped sitting there. The cushion doesn't support you anymore. The fabric scratches your skin, and getting up feels harder than it should. That's what slipping into old patterns is like. They offer a kind of comfort, even when you know they no longer serve you. The key is recognizing that the familiarity you feel isn't safety, it's the echo of an old coping mechanism, and it's no longer designed to hold who you've become. A personal reflection, I've had times when the chair of an old pattern tempted me back. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just small decisions and reactions that felt natural in the moment. A slightly quicker reply than I'd usually give. A little more explaining than necessary. Offering reassurance before it was even asked for. These moments don't seem like much on their own, but they accumulate. And for me, they often came with a quiet voice saying, maybe this time it will be different. That hope, that maybe I can re-enter the pattern without the pain, is the very thing that can lead me back into situations I've already learned to leave. Now I've learned to check in with myself sooner. If I catch that maybe this time thought, it's a signal to stop and evaluate. Is this different, or am I sitting back down in the same chair expecting it to feel new? Psychological insight. This pattern is closely related to the illusion of change in relational psychology, our belief that the old dynamics can be re-entered without reactivating the same issues. Slaughter and Finkel, 2009. The familiarity of the pattern provides emotional comfort in the short term, but often at the expense of long-term growth. Another psychological principle at play is variable reinforcement, Skinner, 1953. When a relationship or dynamic has been unpredictable, sometimes rewarding, sometimes hurtful, the brain can become hooked on the possibility of a positive outcome this time. This is the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. The occasional win reinforces continued engagement, even when the overall pattern is harmful. Recognizing these mechanisms can help disrupt them. Once you see that the pull towards old patterns isn't evidence of their safety, but of your brain's attachment to the familiar, you can make a conscious decision to step away. Insight prompts. What's your old chair, a behavior, dynamic, or habit that feels comfortable but ultimately doesn't serve you? What signs tell you you're about to sit down in it again? Theory in action. The next time you feel pulled towards a familiar but unhealthy dynamic, name it out loud or in writing. Say, this is my old chair. Then list 3 reasons why leaving it empty supports your growth more than sitting in it. Keep that list somewhere visible as a reminder for when the temptation returns. The seduction of explanation. One of the most common doors the past uses to step back in is the need to explain yourself. Old patterns often re-establish themselves not through open conflict, but through the subtle pull to justify, defend, or over-clarify, even when you don't need to. Endless letter. There's a kind of letter you can write over and over without ever sending it, the one that begins, I just want you to understand. It can be a conversation, a message, or even a silent replay in your head. You keep adding details, examples, and context, thinking, if they get my point, things will change. But some situations are not about missing information. They're about unwillingness to receive it. You could write 1,000 versions of that letter, perfectly articulate, rich with evidence, and still the person on the other side might remain unmoved. When we're in an old pattern, explanation can feel like action, but in reality, it's often an attempt to earn safety or approval from someone who either cannot or will not give it. That's why stepping back can feel so unnatural. It's the refusal to play the role the pattern expects from you. Personal reflection. In my own experience, I felt the urge to over-explain rise the moment communication changes tone. It's almost reflexive, an instinct to fill the silence with context so the other person can see my intention. In the past, I believed that clarity alone could fix a dynamic, that if I just gave enough insight into my thinking, the connection could reset. But what I've learned is that this drive often comes from an old place, a part of me that once believed misunderstandings were always my responsibility to correct. It's not that I avoid explanation altogether now, but I'm much more aware of whether I intend to share for mutual understanding or to soothe an anxiety that the other person may not even share. When I feel that pull to explain beyond what's necessary, I've started asking myself, am I doing this because it's truly needed, or because I'm afraid of being misunderstood? That pause changes everything. Psychological insight. This tendency is connected to reassurance-seeking behavior, Joyner and Matulski, 2001, where individuals repeatedly seek confirmation of their worth, intentions, or correctness, often in relationships marked by insecurity. While reassurance can feel temporarily soothing, over time, it can erode self-trust and reinforce the belief that your value is dependent on others' perceptions. It also relates to overcompensation in cognitive behavioral theory, where individuals act in ways that are disproportionate to the perceived threat. In relational contexts, overcompensation can mean offering excessive explanation or justification to prevent conflict, even when no such conflict is imminent. The key is differentiating between sharing, which is mutual and purposeful, and justifying, which is one-sided and often rooted in anxiety. Practicing this awareness helps break the pattern, allowing you to speak only when the communication serves both parties, not just the preservation of your comfort. Insight prompts. When you explain yourself, is it to share your truth or to seek reassurance? How can you tell the difference? Can you recall a time when less explanation would have protected your energy? Theory and action. Before offering an explanation in a tense or shifting dynamic, pause and silently ask yourself, if they don't accept this, will my understanding of myself change? If the answer is no, consider keeping your words concise or choosing not to elaborate at all. This reinforces self-trust and reduces the pull of old patterns. The trap of proving you've changed. One of the most deceptive ways the past slips back into our present is through opportunities that seem like tests of our growth. You feel a pull to prove you've learned, healed, or evolved, and before you know it, you're back in the dynamic you once left behind. Unnecessary exam. Imagine you've completed a long, difficult course. You've passed all the assignments, done the hard work, and finally graduated. Then one day you get a letter inviting you to retake an exam you once failed. There's no real reason to do it. Your qualification is already earned. But you think, if I pass this time, it will show how far I've come. You sit the exam, but halfway through, you remember, this test was never for you. It was built to measure you by old standards that no longer apply. That's what happens when old patterns dress themselves up as opportunities for closure or redemption. You don't need to re-engage to prove your growth. The fact that you've moved beyond that dynamic is proof enough. Personal reflection. I've fallen into this before. Moments where I thought, if I handle this differently this time, I'll know I've grown. It might be replying to a message I'd normally ignore, entertaining a conversation I know isn't healthy, or trying to show patience with a behavior that once hurt me. The truth is, in those moments, I wasn't proving anything new. I was stepping back into an environment where the same dynamics were almost guaranteed to play out. And often, the result wasn't a celebration of my growth. It was frustration that I'd given time and energy to something I'd already outgrown. What I've learned is that growth doesn't always need an audience. The choice not to re-engage, to simply walk away without performing your progress for someone else, can be the most powerful statement you make. Psychological insight. This is related to the concept of self-verification theory, Swan 1983, which suggests that people seek to confirm their self-concept, even if it means revisiting environments that once challenged it. In other words, we sometimes re-enter old situations not because they're good for us, but because they offer a stage to demonstrate who we've become. It also connects to narrative identity research, McAdams, 1993, which shows that we often construct life stories where past wounds are revisited in an attempt to rewrite them. While narrative rewriting can be healing in safe, intentional spaces, doing it within the original harmful context often reactivates the very injuries we're trying to heal. Recognizing when a test is just an invitation back into an old pattern is key. True growth often happens quietly, without needing validation from those who once doubted or hurt you. Insight prompts. When have you felt tempted to prove your growth to someone from your past? Did the experience strengthen your progress or pull you back into old patterns? Theory in action. The next time you feel you're being tested by a familiar dynamic, ask yourself, who is this really for? If the answer is anyone other than you, consider stepping away. Instead, write down 3 private examples of how you've already demonstrated your growth to yourself. The residue that lingers. Even when you successfully resist re-entering an old pattern, something often remains, an emotional aftertaste, a residue that lingers in your thoughts and feelings. This residue isn't always visible to others, but it can subtly affect how you see yourself and how you approach new situations. The faint scent in the room. You know that moment when you walk into a room and catch a faint scent, perfume, smoke, or cooking. That tells you someone was there hours ago. The air feels different, even though the space is now empty. Old patterns leave that kind of trace. You've closed the door on the situation, chosen not to re-engage, but you still catch the scent in your mind. A replay of words, a slight tension in your chest, a quiet wondering of what if. That lingering presence can make it feel as though you haven't truly moved on, even when you have. The challenge is recognizing that residue for what it is, not a sign you've failed, but a natural reminder of where you've been. The goal isn't to scrub the room until it's sterile, but to let new scents, new air, and new experiences fill the space. Personal reflection. I've noticed that even when I make a clean decision to step away from an old dynamic, traces of it can follow me. It might be a moment of second-guessing myself in a new connection, or a slight wariness when communication patterns shift. In the past, I would see this as evidence that I hadn't grown enough, as if true progress meant never feeling the residue at all. But I've learned to see it differently. These traces are just echoes, not chains. They're reminders that I've lived, learned, and adapted. They don't dictate my next move unless I let them. The more I allow those echoes to simply exist without rushing to fix them, the quicker they fade. They stop being warnings and start becoming quiet markers of the distance I've already traveled. Psychological insight. This lingering effect can be understood through the lens of emotional memory, Ledoux, 2000, which suggests that emotional experiences are stored differently from factual memories. They can resurface as feelings or bodily sensations, even when the conscious details are forgotten. It's also related to rumination in cognitive psychology, Nolan Hoeksema, 1991, where the mind cycles through past events in an attempt to extract meaning or closure. While some rumination can be reflective and adaptive, excessive rumination can keep emotional residue alive longer than necessary. What research shows is that acknowledging the residue without engaging it, naming it, noticing it, but not acting from it, allows the brain to reconsolidate the memory in a less emotionally charged form. Over time, the scent becomes weaker, and new associations take its place. Insight prompts what residue from past patterns do you still notice in yourself? How do you usually respond when these traces show up, and is that response helping them fade or making them stronger? Theory in action. When you notice emotional residue from an old pattern, pause and name it out loud or in writing. This is a trace from before, not a truth about now. Then, immediately do something that connects you to your current reality. Call a trusted friend, work on a meaningful project, or simply step outside and ground yourself in the present environment. Catching the knock early old patterns are easier to avoid when you see them coming. The trouble is, they don't usually announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly in tone, timing, or a shift in your reaction, and if you're not paying attention, you can be halfway back inside before you realize the door's even been opened. The sound beneath the music picture being at a gathering with music playing in the background. Everyone's talking, the room feels warm, and then under all the noise you catch a faint knocking sound. At first, you wonder if you imagined it, but once you notice it, you can't unhear it. Old patterns have that same quality. Beneath the distractions of everyday life, there's a subtle knock. Maybe it's a familiar shift in someone's tone, or a quickened heartbeat when you see a name pop up on your phone. Once you train yourself to listen for those knocks, you can decide whether you even want to answer. Personal reflection. I've had moments where the knock was almost imperceptible, a seemingly innocent message, a small request that, in the past, would have pulled me into an exhausting back and forth, a conversation starting to follow a script I've lived through too many times. The difference now is that I've learned to pause and notice. I don't assume that every knock deserves an open door. Sometimes I choose to let it pass without responding, and the moment of silence that follows is far more liberating than any attempt to manage the situation would have been. I've realized that catching the knock early isn't about paranoia. It's about preserving space for the present, so that old patterns don't steal time or energy from what I'm building now. Psychological insight. This approach is rooted in the practice of pattern recognition in cognitive psychology, Matthews and McIntosh, 1998, where identifying consistent cues, even subtle ones, allows you to predict outcomes and adjust your behavior before the full pattern unfolds. It also draws from mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, Siegel, Williams, and Teasdale, 2002, which teaches individuals to observe thoughts, sensations, and emotions without automatically reacting to them. By noticing the earliest signs of a familiar dynamic, you can choose a response that aligns with your current values rather than your past coping mechanisms. Research suggests that this early intervention approach reduces the likelihood of relapse into old habits because it disrupts the chain of automatic responses before momentum builds. The earlier you catch the knock, the easier it is to keep the door closed. Insight prompts. What are your knock signals, the early signs that an old pattern is trying to re-enter your life? How do you typically respond when you first notice them? Carry in action. For the next week, carry a small notebook or use your phone to jot down moments where you sense a familiar pattern emerging. Describe the trigger in detail, words, tone, body sensations, and setting. At the end of the week, review your notes to identify the most consistent knock signals. This awareness will make it easier to choose your responses deliberately. Building forward without looking back, avoiding old patterns, isn't just about shutting the door on them. It's about actively walking towards something else. If you spend too much time guarding the entrance, you can forget to keep building the path ahead. The road under construction, imagine you're paving a new road. Behind you, the old path still exists, cracked and overgrown, but every so often a familiar voice calls from that direction. You can turn around to check if they're still there, or you can keep laying fresh stones beneath your feet. If you keep looking back, progress slows. The road ahead waits, but it can't build itself. Eventually, you have to decide which direction deserves your focus, the one that pulls you back, or the one that takes you further into the life you want. Personal reflection. I've noticed that when I get too focused on avoiding old patterns, I risk staying in a kind of defensive stance, ready to block, guard, or close off. That's necessary at times, but it can also keep me rooted in the past because my energy is still tied to what I don't want, rather than what I do. When I shift my attention toward what I'm actively building, whether that's my work, healthier relationships, or my sense of peace, old patterns lose their grip naturally. They become background noise instead of central threats. It's not about pretending the past never happened. It's about giving the present so much weight, so much intention, that the past simply doesn't have space to move in again. Psychological insight. This approach reflects the principles of approach-oriented coping, Carver and Connor Smith, 2010, where individuals focus on moving toward goals and values rather than solely avoiding negative outcomes. It also connects to positive psychology's broaden and build theory, Fredrickson, 2001, which suggests that focusing on growth-oriented emotions like hope, interest, and joy expands your thought-action repertoire, leading to more creative solutions and stronger personal resources over time. When you invest in the forward path, the effort needed to maintain distance from the past decreases. You're no longer standing guard at the door. You're already so far down the new road that turning back feels irrelevant. Insight prompts. Where in your life are you more focused on avoiding the past than building the future? What small steps could you take this week to invest in the road ahead? Theory. In action, create a forward building list of 5 small, specific actions that align with the life you're creating, not the one you've left behind. Keep the list somewhere visible and make sure at least one action is completed each day. This shifts your focus from defense to growth. Leaving the door closed. If the past comes knocking, remember, you don't have to open the door to prove you've grown. Growth isn't about facing every old test head on. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the test no longer applies to the life you're building. There's a quiet strength in letting the knock fade unanswered. It's the strength of someone who knows that not every invitation is worth accepting, not every old thread needs to be picked up, and not every familiar voice belongs in your new space. When you choose not to answer, you're not being cold or unforgiving. You're protecting the energy that fuels your forward path. That choice leaves room for relationships, projects, and experiences that align with who you are now, rather than who you had to be before. Old patterns may still call your name from time to time, but with each step forward, their pull weakens. Eventually, the sound of the knock will blend into the background, and the road ahead will be so full that turning back simply won't occur to you. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and keep building the life that's calling you forward. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, the Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, the Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse. A journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3. Introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.